Welcome to English 2450 COM 2010 Intro to Film, Week 11, lecture video number 4 on sound design. In this video, I'm going to be talking about the 4 dimensions of film sound and functionality of sound in films. So when I say the 4 dimensions of film sound, what I'm referring to here are 4 different aspects of how sound works in a film compared to other kind of elements of the film, elements of the storytelling, the editing, etc. So these 4 dimensions or aspects of film sound include rhythm, fidelity, space, and time. And I'm going to be kind of pausing every so often to look at some kind of clips that are available on the Canvas page, so it might be helpful for you to pause this lecture video, watch those clips so you have an idea of what I'm talking about when I get to them, and then kind of resume the lecture video at your own pace. So we're thinking about the 4 dimensions of sound. Rhythm, sound occupies a duration of time. A sound can be very short and sharp or very kind of long and leisurely. Therefore, sound has rhythm. Sound has rhythm, right? Fidelity refers to how the sound relates to its perceived source with a lesser or greater fidelity. Sound conveys a sense of the space in which it occurs. And sound also relates to visual events that take place in a specific time, not just a specific space. So sound has a temporal dimension. So sound is rhythmic. It can be more or less, have more or less fidelity. It's spatial and it's temporal. So let's start thinking about rhythm, right? And this is something that we talked about when we talked about visual editing, but it's also obviously a very important part of sound editing as well. Rhythm is associated with music, obviously. So if we're talking about the music that a film uses, the soundtrack, the score, obviously that music has a rhythm to it, but sound effects have a rhythm, and dialogue has a rhythm too, right? So if you think back to kind of, old-timey, like, films and the kind of rapid fire dialogue between characters, like thinking about classic Hollywood films from the 40s, for example. You have a very rapid fire dialogue back and forth, rat-a-tat between different characters, and that creates a certain rhythm. Or maybe the slamming of a door in a film over and over again creates a certain rhythm. So rhythm is obviously associated with music, but sound effects and dialogues also create a certain rhythm within the film. Editing, on-screen movement, and sound are coordinated to work together in a lot of different cases so that the rhythm of the sound and the rhythm of the visuals and the editing all work together in a certain way, but also disparities in the rhythm of the sound, the editing, the on-screen movement can create a jarring effect as well. So whether or not the rhythm of the sound and the rhythm of the visuals match up together can create kind of a cohesion, or they can create kind of an uncohesion, right? A disunity, where things kind of seem a little bit jarring or uncomfortable, right? So we're talking here about editing, right? So the pace at which the cuts are kind of laid out, but also on-screen movement, right? If there are characters or objects moving on the screen, the rhythm or the speed with which they move may or may not match the rhythm of the sound specifically. So if you go to the clips and images in Canvas, there are 2 specific examples here that I think would be helpful to look at. So the first one is where music and sound effects are synchronized with action on screen. And this is a foot chase scene from the film Baby Driver, where the music and the sound effects are synchronized and work very well together with kind of the visuals. So the audio-visual rhythms line up and cohere very nicely. In this next example here, this is from animation, and the music and sound effects are synchronized with the animation in this case as well. Now, this is such a common effect in animation where you match the rhythm of your music to the rhythm of your visuals that it's actually called Mickey Mousing, right? Mickey Mousing is where you match the sound with the action so that it appears as if they are distinctly related to each other. So I have 2 examples of rhythm of visuals and rhythm of music and sound kind of working together to create an overall cohesive whole here from the Baby Driver foot chase scene and then this animated short spooky scary skeletons. So I would suggest watching those. I think that they're both very helpful in terms of thinking about rhythm, how rhythm works. In addition to rhythm, there's also the issue of fidelity, right? Fidelity. So fidelity is basically whether or not the viewer accepts that the sound is coming from the source within the world of the film. Fidelity is basically if we see a dog barking in the image, we expect to hear a dog barking. But if we hear a cat meowing and see a dog barking, there is a lack of fidelity. There is a lack of fidelity. So the dog opens its mouth, we expect to hear a bark, but we actually hear a cat meow. There is no fidelity because we do not accept that the sound is coming from that source. That dog shouldn't be meowing, it should be barking, right? So sometimes for comedic effect, a director or sound designer might mess with the fidelity where you expect to hear one sound but you hear another one and it's kind of funny. Something is too loud, something that should make this sound makes another sound. One of my favorite examples of sound effect with a lack of fidelity is here in the clips, and it's a video where someone has taken Cardi B noises and cut them into Star Wars as sound effects. So rather than hearing a lightsaber or Chewbacca or whatever the sound effect is supposed to be, you hear Cardi B making some kind of strange noise. So that's a lack of sound fidelity. The audience expects to hear the lightsaber noise, the zoom, right? That noise, and you hear something else. So fidelity refers to whether or not we accept that the sound is actually coming from the source, right? That's fidelity. So in addition to rhythm and fidelity, we know that sound can also tell us something about the space, the spatial relations of the scene, what is laid out in front of us visually. So two important considerations here. Now this is an important word that I want you to remember, diegesis, diegesis. The diegesis is the story world. So a diegetic sound is a sound that has a source and exists within the story world. A non-diegetic sound, non-diegesis, is outside of the story world. Now, this really makes sense if you ask yourself the question, are the characters within the story supposed to hear this sound? Is it for them or is it for us, the audience? So a diegetic sound has a source within the story itself. Dialogue, sound effects, an instrument inside the story, those are all diegetic sounds. If a character is sitting on a bench playing a guitar, that sound is diegetic. Other characters within the story can hear it. It is part of the story world. Non-diegetic would be like the score of the film or voiceover narration, right? So we know that when the film's score begins, we don't necessarily expect that the characters within the story can hear that score. It's for us, the audience members. It's not for them, right? And voiceover narration is also for the audience. It's not for the characters. Sometimes directors will kind of toy with these ideas in specific ways to kind of mess with our expectations, but typically a sound is either diegetic, it's within the story world, or it's non-diegetic, it's outside of the story world, and occasionally you'll get examples where sound is transdiegetic. Transdiegetic meaning cross-diegetic, right? Trans meaning cross. So it might seem like a sound exists within the story world, but then it seems like it's not. Or it might seem like the sound doesn't exist within the story world, and then we realize that it actually does. So that's really kind of hard to parse. That's really sort of complicated. There are two good examples I have of clips here. Transdiegetic music in the film Birdman and transdiegetic music in the film Once. So in Birdman, we think that the music is non-diegetic. We think that it's the film's score. But then we realize, it's revealed to us that it's actually within the story world. So we hear some drums, we think, okay, this is the score, and then the characters walk past someone playing the drums, and we realize, oh, that sound is actually coming from the story world. And in the film Once, there's an example where some characters are singing, it's a musical, some characters are singing within the film, and then we move away from those characters and start focusing on someone else, but we can still hear the characters singing. It's gone from being a musical number to being part of the soundtrack, right? So diegetic and non-diegetic music are really important things to consider, but also remember that sometimes a director can kind of mess with us a little bit, right? Sometimes the sound designer can mess with us and make us think that the sound is part of the story world when it's really not, or it's not part of the story world when it really is. So that's what diegetic sound and non-diegetic sound refer to. Is it within the story world or is it outside of the story world? If it's a diegetic sound, we accept that the sound exists within the story world. The characters can hear it, right? A sound can come from on screen, within the frame, or off screen, outside of the frame, right? So I have a good example of off-screen sound here that you can watch, and it's basically the idea that if a character hears a sound but we don't see the source of it, we're supposed to assume that that sound came from off screen. Now, this is used all the time in film, right? You have a character sitting in a room and you hear a knock, 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 right? We don't see the knocking, but we hear the knocking, and we automatically assume it's off screen. It's outside of the frame. A character is knocking on a door or a wall or a ceiling or the floor, who knows what, right? Rapping on a table. But if we don't see it, we still assume that the sound came from within the story world, just outside of our line of vision. So sounds can be diegetic or non-diegetic. If they are part of the story world, they can be on screen or they can be off screen. So those are spatial considerations. But what about temporal considerations? We know that sound also relates to time. So we have synchronous and asynchronous sound. Synchronous sound is hearing the sound at the same time that we see the source produce the sound, right? So in a case of dubbing, this would be like a correct dub where the sound emits from the object or the character at the same time that we expect it to. Asynchronous sound is where the sound is not synchronized with the image. It does not overlap. So if you have like a bad dub, for example, where the character's lips are moving but the sound is just slightly off kilter, that's an example of asynchronous sound, right? So I have an example here from the film Singin' in the Rain of asynchronous sound that might be kind of helpful for you to watch to get an idea of what I'm talking about. And then there's also non-simultaneous sound, which is a different thing entirely. This is like a sonic flashback or a sonic flash forward. That's far less common, right? This is where a character might hear something that someone said earlier in the story. It's not a vision or a dream or an entire flashback, but it's just a flashback on the auditory level. So I have an example here from, oh, excuse me, I accidentally closed that. I have an example here from the film Blade Runner where the main character, Deckard, hears what another character said earlier in the film, and it's just played as like voiceover narration. It's called a sonic flashback. Now, the last kind of temporal element of sound is the idea of a sound bridge. Now, this is when the sound from a previous scene lingers while the image is already presenting the next scene. So a sound bridge is where sound bridges over a cut. So we cut from shot A to shot B, but the sound from shot A is still lingering. We can still hear it. And this is a really good way to kind of paste over that cut so we don't notice it, so it's not as jarring, right? Sound is often used to kind of smooth over the edges of editing to keep it nice and seamless. And I have two examples here. One is from the film The Graduate, and one is from Fritz Lang's M. And Fritz Lang's M uses a bunch of different shots, like shots A, B, C, D, E, all kind of strung together with one kind of consistent sound used to bridge all of those shots together. So that's a temporal use of sound. It makes it seem as though the sound is kind of bridging, although the visuals are changing. So these are all important considerations to keep in mind here. Now, the last thing that I want to mention here is that sound has a lot of different functions in film. It can guide our attention, it can influence how we interpret, create mood or build suspense, develop rhythms. It can build our expectations or create irony. There are so many different things that sound does in film. It's so important to remember that film is not purely a visual medium. Film is an audio visual medium, which means that we have to listen as much as we look. So please keep that in mind as we move forward through the semester and think about how do we hear films. Thank you.